It starts with a knock, not just any knock, but one that echoes deep in the silence of the Appalachian woods, deliberate, sharp, and wrong. Everyone who lives near these mountains has heard the stories. Some laugh them off, others refuse to even speak of them. But if you've ever been alone out here and heard the knockers, you'll understand why those who know the truth never stay long. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the knockers. What they are, what they want, and why some people who hear them are never seen again. A few years ago, I moved to a small town in Appalachia. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I needed a fresh start after my divorce. I was looking for quiet, for space to clear my head, and maybe even write that book I'd always been dreaming about. The cabin I found was perfect. Cheap rent, surrounded by trees, and miles from the nearest neighbor. When I first told the locals where I was staying, I got mixed reactions. Some gave me knowing smiles, the kind you give to someone who doesn't know what they've signed up for. Others tried to warn me. "Don't go walking in those woods at night," one old man said. His face was serious, his voice low. "And if you hear knocking, no matter how close or how far, you don't answer it. You hear me?" I laughed it off, thinking it was some local superstition, like Bigfoot sightings or UFOs. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice things. The first thing was the quiet. I'd lived in the countryside before, but this was different. There were no birds in the trees, no squirrels darting around, no sound of crickets at night. It was an eerie kind of stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the knocks began. The first time I heard it, it was faint. A single knock coming from the trees behind the cabin. I was inside, trying to finish a chapter, and it was late, around midnight. I froze, listening. A few seconds later, another knock came. This one was louder, more insistent, and it sounded closer. I brushed it off as a woodpecker or maybe a branch falling, but then it happened again the next night. And the next. The knocks were always the same, 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced apart. They came from different directions every time, sometimes from the trees, other times from the porch. Once I heard them on the window right behind me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. When the knocks came, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was pitch black, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello," I called out, shining the light toward the trees. No answer. But then the knocks came again, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. I whipped around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hands. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind. I went back inside and locked the door, but I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, I asked around town about the knocking. Most people refused to talk about it, but one woman, a waitress at the diner, pulled me aside. "They're not animals," she whispered. "They're something else. My grandpa used to call them the knockers, said they were spirits or creatures that lived in the mountains older than the trees. They knock to lure you out, to make you follow them into the woods. And if you do, you're never seen again." I wanted to believe she was just messing with me, but there was something in her eyes, fear, maybe regret, that made me wonder if she was telling the truth. That night, I was determined to stay awake and catch whatever, or whoever was behind the knocks. I set up a camera on the porch and stayed inside with the lights off, watching through the window. Around midnight, the knocks came again. 3 sharp raps, this time from the side of the cabin. I grabbed my phone and watched the live feed from the camera. Nothing. The knocks came again, this time louder, closer. Then I saw it. A shadow darted across the porch, too fast to be human. It was tall, hunched over, and moved in a way that made my stomach turn, like it didn't belong. The camera flickered, and when the feed came back, the porch was empty. But the knocks kept coming, louder and faster, as if whatever it was knew I was watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next few days were a blur. The knocks didn't stop, and I started finding strange things around the cabin. Small piles of rocks on the porch, animal bones arranged in patterns, and once a handprint on the window that was too large to be human. I called the landlord to ask if anyone else had experienced anything strange at the cabin. He hesitated before answering. "You should leave," he said. "Pack your things and go." The last tenant didn't listen, and, well, let's just say the place was empty for a reason. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the feeling that if I ran, I'd be running forever. The final night at the cabin was the worst. The knocks started earlier than usual, just after sunset. They came from every direction, faster and louder than before, until it sounded like the walls were shaking. And then, the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the knocking, but as the night went on, they grew louder, clearer. They were calling my name. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, threw my bags into the car, and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road. As I reached the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall and hunched, its glowing eyes following me as I sped away. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out what the knockers really were. But sometimes, late at night, I hear knocking at my window, and I never, ever answer it. It wasn't the first time a group of thrill-seekers had decided to chase a legend, but for Caesar, Josh, and Ezekiel, this trip wasn't just another urban exploration adventure. They were searching for the infamous ghost ship known as the Widow's Grasp. For decades, rumors swirled about the ship's cursed crew, the strange lights seen at sea, and the few brave or foolish souls who returned with stories they couldn't explain. But no one had ever gotten close enough to find the truth. Until now. Caesar was the brains of the operation. Always planning, always calculating. He'd spent months studying maps, cross-referencing old newspaper clippings, and piecing together a pattern from the sightings. Josh, his best friend since high school, was the guy who made things happen. Confident, resourceful, and just reckless enough to make this whole thing exciting. Ezekiel, the newest addition to the group, brought the tech. He had all the fancy equipment, a thermal camera, EVP recorders, even a drone rigged for night vision. The three of them had one goal: find the Widow's Grasp, document everything, and, if they were lucky, become legends themselves. They chartered a boat from a sketchy harbor in Maine. The captain, an old man who introduced himself only as Red, didn't ask many questions. He just looked at them with an expression that was half amusement, half pity. "You kids know what you're doing?" Red asked as they loaded up the gear. "We've done this before," Caesar replied confidently. Red laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. "Not out here, you haven't." The first few hours at sea were uneventful. The sun was still up and the ocean was calm, but there was an odd stillness in the air. Ezekiel set up his equipment, mumbling about battery life and signal strength, while Josh leaned against the railing, staring out at the horizon. By the time the sun dipped below the waterline, things started to feel off. "Did you hear that?" Ezekiel asked, looking up from his monitor. "Hear what?" Josh replied. "Knocking, like someone tapping on the hull." Caesar frowned. "It's probably the waves," but Ezekiel shook his head. "It's too rhythmic, like a signal." Josh laughed it off, but the tension in the air was undeniable. They weren't even close to the ship yet, and already the ocean seemed alive with unseen eyes watching their every move. Around midnight, the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, and unnatural. Even Red seemed uneasy. "Can't go much farther in this," he muttered. "Not unless you want to end up like the Widow's crew." "What do you mean?" Caesar asked. Red hesitated, then shook his head. "Some things are better left alone." But Caesar wasn't backing down. "We're paying you to take us to the coordinates." With a reluctant nod, Red continued. The boat crept forward, cutting through the fog like a knife through cotton. Then they saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, vague and ghostly, barely distinguishable from the mist. But as they got closer, the details came into focus. The Widow's Grasp was real, its masts rising like skeletal fingers, its hull encrusted with barnacles and decay. The ship looked frozen in time, as though it had been waiting for them. Josh let out a low whistle. "I can't believe it. It's actually here." Ezekiel was already setting up the drone. "Let's get some footage before the fog messes with the signal." But Caesar had a different idea. "We're going aboard." The Widow's deck groaned under their weight, every step a protest from a structure that hadn't seen life in decades, maybe longer. The air smelled of salt and rot, and the silence was deafening. "Let's stick together," Caesar said, his voice low. Josh rolled his eyes. "What, you think ghosts are going to jump out at us?" But Ezekiel was quiet. his eyes darting around as though he could feel something the others couldn't. They found the captain's quarters first. The door was warped, but Josh kicked it open with ease. Inside, a desk sat covered in brittle papers, maps, and a compass that spun erratically, as if caught in a magnetic storm. "This is gold," Ezekiel whispered, snapping photos. Then, from somewhere deep within the ship, came the sound of footsteps. At first, they thought it was Red, but when Caesar tried to radio him, there was no response. "Could be the wind," Josh said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Since when does wind sound like boots on wood?" Ezekiel shot back. The footsteps grew louder, echoing up from the lower decks. Then came a low, guttural moan, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your instincts scream to run. "We need to get out of here," Ezekiel said, backing toward the exit. But Caesar was already heading toward the sound. "This is what we came for." Josh hesitated, torn between his friend and the mounting dread clawing at his chest. Finally, he followed, and Ezekiel, cursing under his breath, brought up the rear. The lower decks were a labyrinth of narrow corridors and collapsing beams. The deeper they went, the colder it got, until their breath fogged in the dim light of their flashlights. Then they found it, a room filled with skeletal remains, their bony hands clutching at the walls as though trying to escape. "Oh my God!" Ezekiel whispered. Josh turned to Caesar. "You got your proof. Let's go." But Caesar was fixated on something else. In the center of the room sat a chest, its lid slightly ajar. "Caesar, don't," Ezekiel warned. Ignoring him, Caesar opened the chest. Inside was a strange, pulsating orb glowing faintly with an eerie green light. The moment Caesar touched it, the ship came alive. The moaning grew louder, the footsteps faster. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with rage and despair. "You've doomed us," Ezekiel shouted, grabbing Caesar's arm. Before anyone could react, Josh pulled a knife from his belt. "What the hell are you doing?" Caesar demanded. Josh's face was pale, his eyes wild. "We're not leaving this ship alive. Not all of us." Caesar realized too late what was happening. Josh had planned this from the start: bring them to the widow's grasp, claim the treasure, and leave no witnesses. The fight was brutal, chaotic. In the struggle, the orb shattered, unleashing a blinding light that filled the room. When it faded, the ship was silent once more. But only Ezekiel stumbled back onto Red's boat, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What happened to the others?" Red asked. Ezekiel didn't answer. He just stared at the widow's grasp as it disappeared into the fog, taking its secrets and its vengeance with it. Subscribe if you want more terrifying tales. Don't forget to watch the next video. It's funny how some places just stay with you. They haunt your mind, even when you try to push them away. That's how Amanda felt about Letcher's amusement park. Growing up, it had been a big deal in their small town. Flashing lights, the smell of fried dough, and the sound of kids laughing. But after the accident, the gates were locked, the rides abandoned, and the stories started. Everyone said the place was cursed, but Amanda needed answers. Amanda wasn't an adventurer by any stretch. She worked an average job, lived in an average apartment, and had always been content to let the world's mysteries stay exactly that. Mysteries. But something about Letcher's amusement park wouldn't let her rest. Her mom used to tell her stories about the park, how it had been magical, a place where families came together. But Amanda's mom never talked about the accident, and whenever Amanda asked, her mom's face would cloud over, and she'd change the subject. It was only after her mom passed away that Amanda found the newspaper clippings. They were tucked into an old photo album, wedged between pictures of Amanda as a baby and a family picnic at the lake. Headlines screamed, "Horror at Letcher's, Ride Malfunction Claims 5 Lives. Witnesses report strange sounds before fatal accident. Owner vanishes amid controversy." Amanda stared at the yellowed paper, her hands trembling. Her mom had known something she'd kept hidden. That's how Amanda found herself standing at the rusted gates of Letcher's on a cold October night, a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other. She told herself it was just curiosity, that she just wanted to see it for herself. But deep down, she knew she was chasing a ghost. The gates were heavier than they looked, screeching on their hinges as Amanda pushed them open. Beyond, the park lay in eerie silence. The roller coaster tracks rose into the dark sky like skeletal remains, and the carousel sat still, its once bright colors faded and peeling. Amanda stepped inside, the crunch of gravel under her boots the only sound. She swung her flashlight around, illuminating the decayed remnants of what had once been a place of joy. A broken popcorn machine here, a torn ticket booth there. She made her way toward the heart of the park, where the accident had happened. The clippings had been vague about the details, but they all pointed to the Ferris wheel. As Amanda approached, the temperature seemed to drop. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her flashlight started to flicker. She tapped it against her palm, muttering under her breath. Then she heard it. Laughter. Not the warm, cheerful kind she remembered from her childhood, but high-pitched, almost distorted. It echoed through the park, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Amanda froze, her heart pounding. She scanned the darkness, but there was no one there. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. But the tremor in her voice said otherwise. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its carriages swaying gently in the breeze. Amanda approached cautiously, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. As she reached the base of the wheel, she noticed something strange. The ground beneath it was scorched, blackened in a perfect circle. Amanda knelt down, running her fingers over the charred earth. "What happened here?" she muttered. A sudden clang made her jump, her flashlight tumbling from her hands. It rolled a few feet before stopping, the beam landing on a pair of feet. Amanda's breath hitched. Slowly she looked up. Standing before her was a man in a faded park uniform, his face pale and his eyes empty. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hollow. Amanda scrambled back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just turned and started walking toward the carousel. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Amanda followed. The carousel was just as eerie as the rest of the park. The horses were cracked and weathered, their painted eyes staring blankly ahead. The man stopped in front of one, his hand resting on its chipped mane. "They never fixed it," he said softly. "What are you talking about?" Amanda asked, keeping her distance. "The ride, the gears were faulty. The owner knew, but he didn't care, said it would cost too much to fix." The man turned to her, and for the first time Amanda noticed the faint burn scars on his hands. 5 people died because of him, and now they're trapped here. Amanda's mouth went dry. "Trapped?" He nodded. "They can't leave, and neither can I." Before Amanda could respond, the carousel sprang to life. The music was warped, the notes dragging and twisting into something nightmarish. The horses began to move, their once static bodies jerking as though they were alive. Amanda stumbled back, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "What's happening?" "They're coming," the man said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Who?" The laughter returned, louder and closer this time. Amanda spun around, her heart pounding. Shadows darted between the rides, too quick to catch. "Run!" the man said. Amanda didn't need to be told twice. She bolted, her flashlight bobbing as she weaved through the park. The laughter followed her, growing louder, more frenzied. She tripped over a broken bench, landing hard on the gravel. As she scrambled to her feet, she realized she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like static on a screen. Their faces were distorted, their features twisted into masks of anguish and rage. Amanda backed away, her mind racing. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the figures kept coming, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "Help me!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the laughter. Just when she thought she was done for, a blinding light filled the park. The figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Amanda shielded her eyes, squinting to see the source. It was the man. He stood at the center of the park, holding what looked like a lantern. The light pulsed, driving the shadows back. "They can't hold you here," he called out. "But you have to leave. Now." Amanda didn't argue. She ran for the gates, her legs burning and her lungs screaming for air. The laughter faded as she crossed the threshold, collapsing onto the pavement outside. When she looked back, the park was dark and silent once more. Amanda never went back to Letcher's amusement park, but she couldn't forget what she'd seen or the man who had saved her. Weeks later, she found an old photo of the park's employees and her mom's belongings. Her blood ran cold when she spotted him, standing in the back row, his face unmistakable. The caption read, "Letcher's staff, 1975. He'd been dead for over 40 years. Subscribe if you want more terrifying tales. Don't forget to watch the next video.